The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, stood before the ornate mirror in her dressing room. Her reflection stared back with eyes that held a mixture of determination and barely contained emotion. Today would mark the beginning of the most difficult chapter in their royal journey together. William entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He had been awake since dawn, pacing the gardens and wrestling with thoughts that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders, yet he maintained the composure that had been drilled into him since childhood. The palace staff moved with unusual quietness through the corridors as if sensing the gravity of what was to come. Whispered conversations died as the royal couple passed, replaced by respectful nods and sympathetic glances. Even the most seasoned members of their household, who had witnessed decades of royal drama, seemed affected by the palpable tension. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the delicate pearl necklace that had belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales. The weight of the jewelry felt heavier than usual, carrying with it the expectations and memories of those who had walked this path before her. She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing strength from somewhere deep within. The decision had not come easily. Months of private discussions, sleepless nights, and careful consideration had led them to this crossroads. William's jaw tightened as he recalled the heated debates with palace advisors who struggled to understand their perspective. Some called it unprecedented, others whispered about duty and tradition, but neither William nor Catherine wavered in their conviction. Their children had been informed in the gentlest way possible, though the full implications remained beyond their young understanding. George had asked innocent questions that pierced through their carefully constructed explanations, while Charlotte simply hugged her mother tighter than usual. Little Louis continued his playful antics, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around their family. The media speculation had reached fever pitch in recent weeks. Photographers lined the palace gates with telephoto lenses, hoping to capture any hint of emotion or distress. Tabloid headlines screamed theories and assumptions, most of them wildly inaccurate. Yet somehow the couple maintained their dignified silence, while the world watched and waited. Catherine found herself remembering their wedding day, when hope and joy had filled Westminster Abbey. The same crowds that had cheered their union now held their breath, sensing that something fundamental was shifting within the House of Windsor. The fairy tale narrative that had captivated millions was about to take an unexpected turn. Behind closed doors, private tears had been shed. William had held his wife as she grieved for the life they had built together, knowing that their choice would forever alter not just their own destiny, but that of their children and the monarchy itself. Their love remained unshakable, but love alone could not solve the complex web of circumstances they now faced. The telephone calls to senior royals had been among the most difficult conversations of their lives. The Queen's response had been characteristically measured, though her disappointment was evident in the long pauses between her carefully chosen words. Charles had expressed his concerns with a father's protective instinct, while other family members responded with varying degrees of shock and understanding. Palace lawyers worked around the clock to navigate the unprecedented legal and constitutional implications. Ancient protocols were examined and re-examined as advisors struggled to find historical precedent for what William and Catherine were proposing. The complexity of their situation had created ripples that extended far beyond their personal desires. As the morning progressed, Catherine spent precious moments with each of their children individually. She memorized the way George's eyes lit up when he laughed, how Charlotte's curls bounced when she ran, and the sweet innocence in Louis's sleepy yawn. These memories would need to sustain her through whatever lay ahead. The red leather dispatch, boxes that usually arrived like clockwork, seemed heavier today, filled with documents that would formalize their decision. William's hands shook imperceptibly as he signed papers that would change everything, his usual confident signature appearing somehow smaller and more vulnerable on the cream-colored royal stationery. Their closest friends had been sworn to secrecy, sharing the burden of knowledge that weighed heavily on everyone who understood what was coming. Text messages and private calls offered support and disbelief in equal measure, as those who knew them best struggled to reconcile this decision with the couple they thought they knew. The afternoon brought a series of private meetings with senior palace officials. Faces that had become familiar over years of service wore expressions of professional concern mixed with personal sadness. Even the most protocol-focused advisors seemed to understand that they were witnessing the end of an era. Catherine's mother arrived quietly through a private entrance, her face etched with worry for her daughter. The embrace they shared lasted longer than usual, conveying years of unspoken understanding and maternal support. No words were needed to express the mixture of pride and heartbreak that filled the room. As evening approached, the couple found themselves alone in the sitting room, where they had made countless decisions about their future together. The familiar surroundings that had once brought comfort now felt like witnesses to their transformation. Outside, London continued its bustling rhythm, unaware that history was being written within these walls. The private jet sat ready on the tarmac at RAF Northolt, its engines humming quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. Catherine walked slowly up the aircraft steps, each movement deliberate and measured despite the turmoil in her heart. The weight of her decision felt heavier with every step that took her further from the life she had known for over a decade. William followed behind, carrying a small overnight bag that contained only the most essential items. The man who had once traveled with entire entourages now moved with the simplicity of someone leaving everything behind. His security detail maintained a respectful distance, understanding that this journey required a different kind of protection than they were trained to provide. The aircraft's interior felt strangely empty despite the presence of only essential staff. Gone were the usual briefing papers, the red boxes filled with state documents, and the constant stream of private secretaries with urgent matters requiring attention. Instead, silence filled the cabin like an unwelcome passenger, broken only by the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of newspapers. Catherine stared out the small window as England grew smaller beneath them, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. The countryside that had become her home stretched out in patchwork fields and winding rivers, each landmark carrying memories of official visits, charity engagements, and moments of joy shared with the British people who had welcomed her into their hearts. The destination remained undisclosed to all but a trusted few. A private estate in the Scottish Highlands had been quietly prepared, chosen for its remoteness and the loyalty of those who managed it. Here, away from telephoto lenses and speculation, they could begin the next phase of their plan without the constant scrutiny that had defined their lives for so long. Their phones had been turned off hours ago, cutting the final thread that connected them to their former existence. No more urgent calls from private secretaries, no more briefings about upcoming engagements, no more carefully orchestrated public appearances. The silence felt both liberating and terrifying in equal measure. The children had been left in the care of Catherine's parents, a decision that had required enormous trust and careful planning. George had cried when his mother explained that she would be gone for a while, his young mind unable to fully grasp why Mummy and Daddy couldn't take them along. Charlotte had simply asked if they would come back, her innocent question cutting deeper than any criticism from the press. William reached across the narrow aisle and took his wife's hand, their fingers intertwining with the familiarity of 13 years together. No words passed between them, but their shared glance conveyed volumes about the magnitude of what they had chosen. Love had always been their anchor, and now it would be tested in ways they had never imagined. The flight attendant, a woman who had served the royal family for 2 decades, moved quietly through the cabin offering refreshments with eyes that betrayed her own emotional struggle. She had witnessed countless royal flights, but nothing had prepared her for the somber atmosphere that filled this journey. Even she seemed to understand that she was part of something unprecedented in royal history. Below them, newspaper printing. Presses were already churning out special editions with headlines that would dominate breakfast tables across the Commonwealth. Speculation ran wild as royal correspondents scrambled to piece together fragments of information, their sources within the palace remaining stubbornly silent about the true nature of what was unfolding. The Queen sat in her private study at Windsor Castle, staring at the formal letter that had been delivered just hours before the departure. The elegant handwriting that she had come to know so well over the years now conveyed words that challenged everything she had believed about duty, service, and sacrifice. Her own memories of difficult choices made decades earlier provided little comfort as she contemplated the implications for the crown. Charles paced the floors of Clarence House, his mind racing through the constitutional ramifications of his son's decision. The prince who had waited his entire life to ascend to the throne now faced the possibility of ruling over a monarchy forever changed by this moment. His understanding of duty warred with his love for his son, creating an internal conflict that sleep could not resolve. The aircraft began its descent toward a private airstrip surrounded by heather-covered hills and ancient stone walls. The landing was smooth, but the impact on their lives would prove anything but gentle. As the engines wound down, Catherine and William prepared to step into a world where their titles meant nothing and their future remained unwritten. A single Range Rover waited on the tarmac, its driver a man whose discretion had been proven over many years of service to the royal family. He nodded respectfully as they approached, understanding without words that this journey required the utmost confidentiality. The Scottish air felt crisp and clean after the recycled atmosphere of the aircraft, carrying with it the scent of freedom and uncertainty. The estate house sat nestled in a valley protected by towering pines and rolling hills, its windows glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. Here, in this sanctuary far from the reaches of paparazzi and protocol, they would finally have the space to breathe and plan their next steps. The building itself seemed to exhale with relief as they approached, as if it too had been holding its breath. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books and family portraits of people they had never met. The housekeeper, a local woman whose loyalty had been secured through years of discreet service, had prepared simple meals and fresh linens with the same attention to detail she might give to visiting royalty, understanding that comfort now mattered more than ceremony. That first night in Scotland, Catherine and William sat before the fire holding hands in silence, both lost in thoughts of what they had left behind and what lay ahead. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing hour with steady determination, counting down the moments until the world would wake to find that everything had changed forever. Dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands with unusual brightness, as if nature itself recognized the significance of this new day. Catherine woke to unfamiliar sounds, the gentle lowing of distant cattle, the rustle of wind through ancient oaks, and the complete absence of London's urban symphony that had become the soundtrack to their royal existence. The morning brought their first real taste of the choice they had made. No lady-in-waiting appeared with carefully selected outfits. No private secretary arrived with the day's schedule, and no security briefings interrupted their quiet breakfast. William found himself making tea for the first time in years, his hands remembering skills that privilege had nearly erased from memory. Their phones, switched on for the first time since leaving London, immediately erupted with hundreds of missed calls and text messages. The outside world had finally awakened to their absence, and the reaction was everything they had feared and expected. Catherine's hands trembled as she scrolled through messages from friends, family, and colleagues, each one carrying its own weight of confusion, support, or accusation. The morning newspapers delivered by the estate manager with apologetic eyes painted their story in bold headlines across every front page. Royal runaway, screamed one tabloid, while another proclaimed, "The Great Escape." The photographs were all archive images, their wedding day, official portraits, candid shots from recent engagements, frozen moments from a life that now felt like it belonged to different people entirely. BBC News ran continuous coverage with royal experts debating the constitutional implications of their decision. Constitutional lawyers appeared on morning television shows, attempting to explain precedents that didn't exist, while royal biographers speculated about motivations they couldn't possibly understand. The world seemed desperate for answers that Catherine and William weren't yet ready to provide. The children's voices crackled through a secure phone line, their innocent chatter providing both comfort and heartbreak. George asked when Mummy and Daddy were coming home, while Charlotte wanted to know if they had seen any Highland cows during their adventure. Little Louis babbled happily in the background, blissfully unaware that his parents' faces were plastered across newspaper stands throughout the Commonwealth. Parliament was recalled for an emergency session, with MPs demanding explanations that the palace could not provide. The Speaker of the House struggled to maintain order, as representatives from across the political spectrum voiced concerns about the stability of the constitutional monarchy. Some called for investigations, others for understanding, but all recognized that they were witnessing an unprecedented crisis in royal history. International news networks picked up the story with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism. American morning shows breathlessly reported on the royal crisis, while European broadcasters analyzed the potential impact on diplomatic relations. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting and condemning their decision, creating a digital battlefield where strangers argued about choices they didn't fully understand. Catherine spent hours walking the estate's winding paths, her mind processing the magnitude of what they had set in motion. The Highland landscape offered a peace that palace life had never provided, yet each step carried the weight of consequences that extended far beyond their personal happiness. She found herself questioning whether love alone could justify the chaos they had unleashed. William immersed himself in practical concerns, reviewing legal documents and financial arrangements that would secure their family's future outside the royal structure. The man who had been groomed from birth to inherit the throne now planned a life where his birthright meant nothing. His training in constitutional law, once intended to prepare him for kingship, now served to help him navigate his departure from that destiny. The Queen's private secretary called repeatedly. Each attempt to establish communication met with polite but firm declination. The monarch's legendary composure was reportedly being tested as never before, with courtiers whispering about sleepless nights and cancelled engagements. The woman who had sacrificed everything for duty now faced the rebellion of those she had expected to follow her example. By midday, Downing Street released a carefully worded statement, acknowledging the personal decision of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, while emphasizing the government's continued support for the constitutional monarchy. The Prime Minister's measured words couldn't hide the political earthquake that was reshaping Britain's relationship with its oldest institution. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued his own statement, speaking of prayer, understanding, and the complex nature of modern service to God and country. His words carried the weight of someone who understood the spiritual dimensions of their struggle, yet even his diplomatic language couldn't bridge the growing divide between tradition and personal truth. Catherine's family maintained their silence despite being besieged by reporters camped outside their Berkshire home. Her mother's strength became legendary among those who knew her, deflecting questions with grace while privately grieving for her daughter's pain. The Middleton family's loyalty never wavered, even as they faced scrutiny that threatened to consume their previously private existence. International royal families watched with mixture of fascination and concern, recognizing that the British monarchy's crisis could impact the very concept of hereditary rule. European monarchs who had successfully modernized their institutions studied the unfolding drama for lessons about balancing tradition with contemporary expectations. As afternoon faded into evening, Catherine and William found themselves once again before the fireplace, this time surrounded by newspapers whose headlines told versions of their story that bore little resemblance to their actual experience. The flames consumed each page as they fed their unwanted fame to the fire, watching their public personas disappear in smoke and ash. The cottage that sheltered them felt smaller with each passing hour, not from physical constraints, but from the growing pressure of a world demanding answers. Outside, somewhere beyond the protective hills and loyal staff, Britain was beginning to reckon with the possibility that fairy tales could end, not with happily ever after, but with the painful truth that sometimes love requires the courage to walk away from everything you've ever known. The secure telephone line crackled to life at precisely 9 o'clock on their third morning in Scotland, carrying the voice Catherine had both longed to hear and dreaded facing. The Queen's words were measured and careful, each syllable weighted, with decades of experience managing royal crises. Yet underneath the formal tone lay unmistakable hurt and confusion. "Catherine, my dear," the monarch began, her voice carrying across the Highland landscape with surprising clarity. "I believe it is time we spoke directly. The conversation that followed would later be remembered as one of the most difficult in either woman's life, as grandmother and granddaughter-in-law navigated the treacherous waters between duty and personal fulfillment. William listened from across the room, his face reflecting the internal struggle between his respect for his grandmother and his commitment to the path they had chosen. The man who had once stood at attention during royal briefings now sat slumped in a simple wooden chair, watching his wife bear the weight of explaining their inexplicable decision to the woman who had sacrificed everything for the crown. Queen's questions were direct and unflinching. She asked about the children's welfare, about William's understanding of his constitutional obligations, and about whether they had truly considered the consequences for the monarchy they were abandoning. Catherine's answers came slowly, each response carefully constructed to convey both respect and unwavering determination. Outside their Highland refuge, the media circus had grown to unprecedented proportions. Satellite trucks lined the narrow, country roads, their massive dishes pointed skyward like technological prayers seeking divine intervention in the royal drama. Local villagers found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their quiet community transformed overnight into the epicenter of global attention. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived unannounced that afternoon, his modest rental car a stark contrast to the usual royal convoy that would have accompanied such a visit in their former life. His presence carried the weight of both spiritual guidance and institutional pressure, as he attempted to bridge the gap between personal conscience and public duty that had torn the couple from their established existence. Their conversation stretched into the early evening, punctuated by long silences as all three grappled with questions that had no easy answers. The Archbishop spoke of service taking many forms, while Catherine and William struggled to articulate feelings that seemed too large for ordinary language. The cottage's simple furnishings bore witness to exchanges that would reshape the relationship between church and crown for generations to come. Meanwhile, in London, the machinery of constitutional government ground forward with unusual uncertainty. Legal experts worked around the clock to understand the implications of William's potential abdication of his place in the line of succession, while constitutional historians searched centuries of precedent for guidance that simply didn't exist in their current circumstances. Parliament buzzed with urgent debates about the future of the monarchy, with some MPs calling for immediate modernization, while others demanded the couple's return to duty. The Speaker struggled to maintain order, as representatives voiced concerns that ranged from the practical matter of future coronations to the philosophical question of what loyalty meant in the 21st century. Charles found himself thrust into the role of de facto spokesman for the royal family, a position he had never wanted under these circumstances. His public appearances carried new weight as the nation looked to him for stability and continuity, while his son and daughter-in-law remained in self-imposed exile. The burden aged him visibly, each public engagement a reminder of the family fracture that threatened everything he had spent his life preparing to inherit. International reaction continued to pour in from around the world, with foreign governments walking the delicate line between respecting British sovereignty and maintaining diplomatic relationships that might need to adapt to a changed constitutional landscape. Embassy staff worked overtime to reassure international partners while privately preparing contingency plans for various outcomes. The children, still staying with Catherine's parents, began showing signs of confusion despite their grandparents' efforts to maintain normalcy. George asked increasingly complex questions about why his parents couldn't come home, while Charlotte created drawings of their family that royal protection officers found both touching and heartbreaking. Their innocence provided a stark contrast to the sophisticated constitutional crisis unfolding around them. Social media campaigns emerged on both sides of the debate, with hashtags supporting royal duty competing against those advocating for personal freedom. Digital activists organized virtual rallies, while traditional supporters of the monarchy held vigils outside palace gates, their signs and chants reflecting a nation divided about the very nature of modern royalty. Catherine's health became a subject of intense speculation as telephoto lenses captured glimpses of her walking the estate grounds. Royal correspondents analyzed her posture and expression for signs of regret or determination, their reports feeding a public hungry for any insight into the minds of the couple whose decision had shaken the foundations of British society. The evening brought another difficult phone call, this time from Prince Harry calling from his home in California. His voice carried the weight of his own complicated relationship with royal duty, offering understanding born from his own struggles with the constraints of hereditary obligation. The conversation between the brothers lasted well into the night, exploring themes of family loyalty, personal truth, and the price of public service that had defined their lives since birth. As Catherine and William prepared for another night in their Scottish sanctuary, they found themselves changed by the day's encounters. The conversations with family members, spiritual advisors, and their own consciences had clarified nothing while making everything more complex. Their love remained constant, but the world around them continued to shift in ways they were only beginning to understand. The morning of their 5th day in Scotland dawned grey and misty, as if the Highland weather had finally aligned itself with the somber mood that pervaded their refuge. Catherine stood at the kitchen window, watching droplets of rain trace paths down the glass like the tears she had been holding back for days. The time for hiding was coming to an end, and both she and William knew it. The secure phone had been ringing almost constantly since dawn, bringing news that made their continued isolation increasingly untenable. Their private secretary reported that Buckingham Palace was preparing an official statement, one that would be released with or without their input. The machinery of monarchy would not pause indefinitely for their personal crisis. William found himself pacing the cottage's small rooms like a caged animal, his tall frame seeming too large for spaces that had initially offered sanctuary but now felt confining. The man who had once commanded military units and addressed Parliament was reduced to walking endless circles around furniture that had witnessed countless conversations about their impossible situation. The children's daily call brought fresh heartache as George announced he had packed a bag to come find Mummy and Daddy in Scotland. His innocent determination to reunite their family highlighted the one aspect of their situation that neither adult could rationalize or accept. Charlotte's tearful questions about when they would all be together again cut deeper than any criticism from the press or pressure from palace officials. A new visitor arrived that afternoon, driving up the winding estate road in an unremarkable sedan that belied the importance of its occupant. Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, had traveled north carrying documents that would formalize whatever decision William and Catherine ultimately made. His presence transformed their peaceful refuge into an extension of the constitutional crisis they had hoped to escape. The meeting took place in the cottage's small sitting room, where Sir Edward laid out papers with the precision of a man who had spent decades managing royal transitions. The documents included formal abdication papers, financial settlement agreements, and custody arrangements that treated their children's futures with the same careful attention given to state secrets. The reality of permanent separation from royal life was spelled out in legal terminology that made their abstract desires terrifyingly concrete. Catherine studied each page with the attention to detail that had served her well during years of royal engagements. But now the documents described the dissolution of everything those engagements had represented. Her signature on these papers would end not just her role as Duchess but her children's inheritance of titles and privileges that stretched back centuries through William's bloodline. The conversation with Sir Edward revealed the full scope of consequences they had not initially considered. International treaties might require renegotiation, charitable patronages would need reassignment, and diplomatic relationships carefully built over decades could be affected by their departure from public life. The personal had become political in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Meanwhile, in London, the Queen met with her inner circle of advisors in a session that would later be remembered as one of the most crucial in her reign. The sovereign, who had weathered numerous scandals and constitutional challenges, now faced a crisis that threatened the very principle of hereditary duty that had defined her entire existence. Her options were limited, and none of them guaranteed the stability she had spent 7 decades maintaining. The afternoon brought news that protesters had gathered outside the Scottish estate's gates, though their messages were mixed and confusing. Some demanded the couple's return to duty, while others supported their right to choose personal happiness over public obligation. Police maintained order while reporters interviewed anyone willing to offer opinions about royal duty, family responsibility, and the nature of modern service to crown and country. Catherine's mother called with updates about the children that brought both comfort and anguish. The grandparents were maintaining routines and stability, but the children's questions were becoming more sophisticated and harder to answer. George had started asking about constitutional monarchy after overhearing adult conversations, while Charlotte simply wanted to know if Mummy still loved her. Their innocence remained intact, but their childhood was being shaped by circumstances far beyond their understanding. The international reaction continued to evolve as governments and institutions grappled with the precedent being set by William and Catherine's actions. Commonwealth nations found themselves in the delicate position of balancing loyalty to the crown, with recognition that the individuals wearing it were human beings with personal needs that might conflict with public duty. Religious leaders worldwide offered prayers and perspectives that ranged from condemnation to compassion, reflecting the global struggle to understand how personal conviction should be weighed against inherited obligation. The Archbishop of Canterbury's earlier visit had sparked conversations in parishes and cathedrals about the intersection of faith, duty, and individual conscience that would continue long after the immediate crisis resolved. As evening approached, Catherine and William found themselves once again seated before the fire, but this time surrounded by legal documents that could end their royal lives with a few signatures. The flames that had consumed unwanted newspapers now illuminated papers that represented the most consequential decision of their lives, one that would affect not just their own futures, but those of their children and the institution they were prepared to abandon. The cottage's grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm, marking time that was running out for reflection and moving inexorably toward action. Outside, Scotland's ancient hills stood sentinel over a drama that would reshape the relationship between tradition and personal truth for generations to come. While inside, two people who had once seemed destined for fairy tale endings prepared to write a different kind of conclusion to their royal story. The final morning in Scotland arrived with crystalline clarity, as if the Highland mist had lifted to reveal not just the landscape but the path forward that had eluded them for days. Catherine woke before dawn, her decision made during the quiet hours when sleep had finally released her from the weight of endless deliberation. Beside her, William stirred with the same sense of resolution that seemed to emanate from the very walls of their temporary sanctuary. The formal abdication documents lay unsigned on the kitchen table, their legal language stark against the simple, wooden surface where they had shared meals and conversations that would forever define their lives. Neither Catherine nor William approached the papers immediately, understanding that this moment required acknowledgement of all they were choosing to preserve and all they were willing to surrender. Their final secure call to the children brought laughter and tears in equal measure. George's excitement about seeing his parents again was infectious, while Charlotte's innocent questions about whether they had learned to be happy during their time away struck at the heart of what they had been trying to achieve. Little Louis's babbling provided a soundtrack of pure joy that reminded them why some choices transcended duty and tradition. The Queen's final call came precisely at 9 o'clock, her voice carrying decades of experience with impossible decisions and the weight of understanding that had grown between them over the past week. The conversation was brief but profound. Grandmother and granddaughter-in-law reaching an understanding that would reshape their relationship and the monarchy itself in ways neither could fully anticipate. William's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the fountain pen that would formalize their departure from royal life. The instrument that had signed countless official documents during years of dutiful service, now poised over papers that would release him from obligations he had never chosen, but had embraced until love demanded a different kind of courage. His signature, when it came, was steady and clear, each letter a deliberate choice about the life he wanted to live. Catherine's signature followed, her elegant handwriting transforming legal documents into personal declarations of independence from a system that had offered privilege at the cost of authenticity. The woman who had curtsied to queens and charmed world leaders now wrote her name as simply Catherine Middleton, reclaiming an identity that had been subsumed by titles and protocols she no longer wished to carry. Sir Edward Young witnessed their signatures with the solemnity of a man who understood he was documenting the end of an era. His careful handling of the documents reflected both professional duty and personal sadness at the conclusion of relationships that had transcended their official nature. The papers were sealed and prepared for immediate courier to London, where constitutional history would be made with unprecedented speed. The journey back to London was markedly different from their escape just 1 week earlier. The same private aircraft carried them south, but the passengers were fundamentally changed people who had chosen love over legacy and personal truth over public expectation. Their faces bore the marks of difficult decisions, but also the peace that comes from accepting the consequences of authentic choice. London greeted their return with a mixture of chaos and celebration, as supporters and critics alike gathered to witness the unprecedented spectacle of royals choosing civilian life. The crowds outside their former residence at Kensington Palace had been managed by police, but nothing could contain the emotional energy that crackled through the air as Britain processed the reality of their decision. The children's reunion with their parents took place away from cameras, in the private sanctuary of Catherine's childhood home, where normalcy had been carefully preserved despite the week's upheaval. Their embraces lasted longer than usual, as if physical contact could bridge the gap created by absence and the profound changes that separation had brought to their family dynamic. The Queen's statement, released simultaneously with news of the signed documents, was masterful in its balance of respect for their decision and reaffirmation of monarchical continuity. Her words acknowledged the personal courage required for their choice while making clear that the institution would endure and adapt as it had for centuries. The sovereign's grace under unprecedented pressure became part of her legacy. Parliament's response reflected the constitutional uncertainty their decision had created, with emergency sessions scheduled to address questions about succession, the role of remaining royals, and the broader implications for Britain's relationship with its hereditary institutions. Democracy would need to absorb and respond to challenges that constitutional scholars had never seriously contemplated. International reaction ranged from admiration for their courage to concern about stability within one of the world's oldest, continuously operating monarchies. Diplomatic cables worked overtime as governments sought to understand how the change would affect relationships that had been built on centuries of royal protocol and tradition. The cottage in Scotland stood empty as evening fell, its rooms returning to the quietness that had been interrupted by one of the most consequential weeks in modern royal history. The estate manager secured the building with the care of someone who understood that these walls had sheltered a transformation that would be studied and debated for generations to come. Catherine and William spent their first evening as private citizens in the same sitting room where they had made countless royal decisions. But now the conversation centered on schools for their children, career possibilities, and the ordinary concerns of people whose extraordinary circumstances had finally aligned with their deepest desires. The fairy tale had ended not with traditional happiness but with the more complex satisfaction of choices made with full knowledge of their cost. Outside, Britain continued its ancient rhythms while adjusting to a new reality where even the most privileged individuals could choose personal authenticity over inherited obligation. The poised goodbye that had begun with tears would conclude with the quiet dignity of people who had found the courage to write their own ending to a story that had seemed predetermined by birth and circumstance.